You think you know what fire is. You have seen it your entire life. A flame rises, flickers, dances in the air, consuming whatever it touches. It feels like a thing, almost like an object you could point to and say, that is fire. But the moment you try to define it clearly, something strange happens. The certainty begins to fall apart, because when you look closer, the flame never stays the same. Every instant it changes shape, color, intensity, yet your mind treats it as one continuous thing. That contradiction is where the problem begins, because something that constantly changes should not feel like a stable object at all, yet your brain insists on seeing it as a single entity that exists in front of you. That illusion feels natural, but it hides something deeper about what fire really is beneath the surface and what you are actually seeing. We usually explain fire in simple terms. It is burning material, heat, light, energy being released. That explanation feels satisfying because it connects to what we already understand. Wood burns, fuel burns, oxygen feeds the flame. But this way of thinking quietly assumes that fire is something being produced, like a substance coming into existence. And that is where the confusion begins, because fire is not a substance you can isolate or store. You cannot take a piece of fire and hold it in your hand. The moment the process stops, the fire disappears completely. There is no leftover object that remains once the reaction ends. That alone should force you to rethink what you are actually looking at. Because if something can vanish entirely without leaving behind any physical trace, then maybe it was never a thing in the first place at all, even though it seems so obvious. Now think about how fire behaves moment to moment. You light a match, and a small flame appears. It grows, shifts, sometimes splits, sometimes disappears, and returns again. It reacts instantly to the slightest change in air, fuel, or movement. If you block oxygen, it dies. If you add more fuel, it expands. That means what you are seeing is not a fixed object, but something that exists only as long as certain conditions are maintained. The moment those conditions change, the fire transforms or disappears entirely. So instead of thinking of fire as something that exists on its own, you have to start thinking of it as something that depends on everything around it at all times. And that shift in thinking leads to a much deeper question about what fire really is beneath all these changing conditions that you cannot ignore anymore once you begin to question. And this is where the illusion finally breaks, because the more carefully you observe fire, the less it behaves like something you can point to and define. It has no stable identity, no fixed boundary, no permanent form you can capture. What you are really seeing is something happening, not something existing. A process unfolding in real time, shaped by invisible interactions between molecules, energy, and motion. But that idea creates a deeper problem, because if fire is not a thing, then why does it feel so real, so present, so undeniable every time you look at it with your own eyes in front of you? That question is what forces you to go beyond intuition and start rethinking everything you assumed about fire from the beginning, because the answer is far stranger than it first appears to be when you truly examine it closely than you ever expected before. Most people never question what fire is because the explanation feels obvious from the very beginning. You light wood, it burns, heat comes out, and a flame appears. That seems complete. Fire is just burning material, a simple cause and effect. Fuel plus oxygen equals flame. And because that explanation works in everyday situations, your brain accepts it without resistance. It feels practical, clear, and easy to understand. But there is a hidden assumption inside that idea that almost no one notices. When you say fire is burning material, you are treating fire like something that is produced, like a substance that comes into existence during the process. You imagine the wood turning into fire the way ice turns into water, but that comparison quietly misleads you. Because when ice melts, the water remains. When burning stops, fire does not remain. It disappears completely. That difference is not small. It is fundamental. Think about it carefully. If fire were a substance, then when the reaction ends, something should be left behind that you could still call fire. But there is nothing. No leftover flame, no stored fire, nothing you can isolate. All that remains is ash, gas, and heat that has already dissipated. The fire itself is gone as if it was never there to begin with. And yet, while it exists, it feels incredibly real. You can see it, feel its heat, watch it move. It even behaves in ways that feel almost alive. It grows when fed, shrinks when starved, reacts to its environment instantly. This creates a powerful illusion. Your brain interprets these behaviors as signs of something existing independently, something with its own identity, but that interpretation is not coming from reality itself. It is coming from how your mind organizes what it sees. Because your brain is designed to recognize stable objects, not dynamic processes. When something changes continuously, but maintains a recognizable pattern, your mind compresses that change into a single identity. A flame looks continuous, so your brain treats it as one thing, even though every part of it is constantly being replaced. The particles you see glowing in one moment are not the same particles in the next. The structure you observe is not stable. It is being rebuilt again and again, faster than you can perceive. This is where the idea of fire as a thing begins to break, because what you are actually seeing is not an object, but a pattern of activity, a pattern that exists only while energy is flowing and reactions are happening. The moment that flow stops, the pattern disappears instantly, not slowly, not gradually, but completely. That is not how objects behave. That is how processes behave. And yet, everyday language hides this from you. We say the fire is burning as if the fire itself is doing something. But in reality, nothing called fire is acting. What is happening is a chemical reaction between fuel and oxygen. The flame is just the visible part of that reaction, not the cause of it. It is the effect, not the entity. This confusion is reinforced by how fire interacts with the world. It spreads, it consumes, it transforms materials. These actions make it feel like an active agent. But all of those behaviors come from underlying reactions, not from fire as an independent thing. Fire is not causing change. It is the appearance of change. So the reason the simple explanation feels correct is not because it captures the full truth, but because it matches how your brain prefers to interpret the world. It simplifies a complex process into a single object, making it easier to understand, but at the cost of accuracy. And once you see that clearly, something important shifts, because if fire is not a substance, not an object, not a thing that exists on its own, then what you have been calling fire all this time is something else entirely. Something more abstract, more dynamic, and far less intuitive than it first appears. And that realization forces you to go deeper, because if fire is not a thing, then what exactly is it? To understand what fire really is, you have to let go of the idea that it exists as a separate object and start seeing it as something happening. At its core, fire is a chemical reaction called combustion. It is not a thing you can point to, but a process where fuel reacts rapidly with oxygen, releasing energy in the form of heat and light. But even that description can feel abstract. So let's break it down. When a material like wood burns, its molecules are being rearranged. Bonds between atoms are breaking and new bonds are forming. This rearrangement releases energy because the new molecular structure is more stable than the old one. That released energy is what you experience as heat. Now here is where it becomes visible. Some of that energy excites electrons inside atoms and molecules, pushing them into higher energy states. When those electrons return to lower energy states, they release that energy as photons. That emission of photons is what you see as light. The flame is not a substance. It is light being continuously produced by countless microscopic transitions happening at the same time. And this is happening constantly, moment by moment. The particles glowing in one instant are not the same ones in the next. The flame is being rebuilt continuously from new reactions. It has no fixed identity, no permanent structure. It only exists as long as the reaction continues. This is why fire disappears instantly when the reaction stops. Remove oxygen, and the reaction cannot continue. Remove fuel, and there is nothing left to react. Without those conditions, there is no energy release, no excited particles, no light. The flame does not fade into something else. It simply stops existing because the process itself has ended. Think about how different that is from an object. A rock remains a rock even if nothing is happening to it. But fire cannot exist without constant activity. It is entirely dependent on ongoing change. That makes it fundamentally different from anything we usually think of as a thing. There is also something deeper hidden in this process. Fire is not just producing heat and light. It is transforming matter into energy flow. The solid fuel becomes gases. Heat spreads into the environment. Light radiates outward. What you are seeing is a transition from one form of organization to another, driven by energy release. So when you look at a flame, you are not looking at an object sitting in space. You are watching energy being converted and released in real time, a continuous transformation that only appears stable because it happens so quickly and consistently. And once you see fire this way, the original question changes completely, because the flame is no longer something you can define as a thing. It becomes a visible window into a process, something that exists only as long as change itself continues. Once you accept that fire is not a thing but a reaction, the next question becomes even stranger. Why does a flame look the way it does? Because if it's just energy being released, there should be no clear shape, no structure, nothing stable to recognize. And yet, every flame has a form. It rises, narrows, flickers, and even changes color in predictable ways. That seems like the behavior of an object, but it isn't. The shape of a flame is not created by the fire itself. It is created by the movement of hot gases. When fuel burns, it produces heated gases that are less dense than the surrounding air. These gases rise due to buoyancy, pulling fresh oxygen in from below. This creates a continuous upward flow, giving the flame its familiar teardrop shape. So what looks like a stable form is actually a pattern created by motion. Now consider the colors inside a flame. You might think the color comes from the fire as a whole, but it actually comes from specific atoms and molecules emitting light at different energies. A blue flame, for example, indicates more complete combustion and higher temperatures, where excited molecules emit higher energy photons. A yellow or orange flame comes from tiny glowing particles, often carbon, heated until they emit light like miniature embers suspended in gas. This means that even the color of fire is not a property of a single thing. It is the result of countless microscopic events happening simultaneously, each contributing a small piece to the overall appearance. Change the fuel, the oxygen supply, or the temperature, and the entire visual structure shifts instantly. Then there is the instability of flames. If you watch closely, a flame is never still. It flickers, stretches, collapses, and reforms constantly. This happens because the flow of gases and energy is inherently unstable. Small disturbances in air movement, temperature, or fuel distribution grow rapidly, reshaping the flame in unpredictable ways. The flame you see is a constantly changing pattern, not a fixed structure. In some extreme conditions, fire behaves even more strangely. Under very high temperatures, parts of a flame can become partially ionized, meaning electrons are stripped from atoms, creating a state similar to plasma. This blurs the line between fire and other forms of energetic matter, showing that what we call a flame is part of a broader spectrum of physical behavior. All of this leads to a deeper realization. A flame is not defined by its boundaries, because it has none. It is defined by a balance of forces, chemical reactions releasing energy, fluid dynamics shaping motion, and electromagnetic interactions producing light. Remove any one of these, and the flame disappears or transforms completely. So what you see is not a thing occupying space, but a dynamic system maintaining itself through constant change. A flame exists only as long as energy flows through it, organizing chaos into a temporary pattern that your eyes interpret as something real. And that raises a final question. If fire is just energy in motion, shaped by invisible forces, then why does it feel so familiar, so natural, almost like a basic element of reality itself? By now, fire should no longer feel like a simple object. It is not something that exists on its own, but something that happens when energy flows through matter in a specific way. And once you see that clearly, something surprising begins to emerge. Fire is not unique. It is just one example of a much larger pattern that appears throughout nature. Because in a deeper sense, life itself behaves in a very similar way. Your body is not a fixed object either. It feels solid and stable, but at the molecular level, it is constantly changing. Cells break down and rebuild. Molecules are replaced, energy flows in through food and out through heat. Just like a flame, your body exists only as long as this flow continues. The moment that flow stops, the structure can no longer maintain itself. This is not a coincidence. Both fire and life are systems driven by energy transformation. Fire rapidly converts chemical energy into heat and light. Living systems convert energy more slowly, organizing it into complex structures that sustain themselves over time. But in both cases, what you are seeing is not a static thing. It is a process that persists by constantly changing. This idea leads to a powerful shift in perspective. What we often call things in the world are actually stable patterns of activity. They appear solid because the processes behind them are consistent. A flame looks continuous because reactions happen fast enough to maintain its shape. A living organism appears stable because its internal processes constantly repair and regulate it. So when you look at fire, you are not just seeing something burn. You are witnessing energy moving through matter, creating temporary order before it disperses again. And that same principle is everywhere. In metabolism, in ecosystems, even in the stars. The real insight is this: fire is not a special case. It is a visible reminder that reality is not made of fixed things, but of processes unfolding over time. And once you see that, it becomes harder to think of anything as truly permanent, because in the end, what you call a thing may simply be a pattern that hasn't stopped yet.